City Council Financing Civic Infrastructure Task Force special meeting, Monday, February the 3rd, 2020. And I have asked Glenn Smith to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, and we'll have the roll call, please.
Mayor Ellsworth.
Here.
Vice Mayor Doring.
Here.
Councilmember Chouteau.
Here.
Councilmember Knudsen.
Present.
Councilmember Koberstein.
Here.
Task force members. Committee Member Ward.
Here.
Committee Member McBroom.
Here.
Committee Member Hale.
Here.
Committee Member David.
Here.
Committee Member Keneally.
Here.
Committee Member Honig. Absent. And Committee Member Wallach. And just as a reminder, when you do speak into the mic, please make sure you press the button. Thank you.
Okay, now the section for public comment. Under California law, public comments at special meetings are limited to subjects on the agenda only. Therefore, public comment will take place during consideration of the item. Each person's comments shall be limited to 4 minutes. So with an introduction, we're here today to talk about the Infrastructure Task Force, and I want to go around the room to the task force members and just ask you please to introduce yourself and give us just a very brief sort of one sentence little background, if you would please. So I will start with Mr. Wallach on this end.
Thank you. My name is Richard Wallach. My background is in engineering, project management, and construction, so I would be focusing more of my work in those areas for the task force.
Thank you. And Ms. Ward.
My name's Philippa Ward. I grew up here and then lived on the East Coast for about 11 years, and now I am back. And I have experience in real estate. I've been a broker for 19 years and have done everything from commercial, including hotels, all the way through residential, farms, ranches. So.
Thank you. And Mr. Hale.
Name is Daniel Hale. Live on Madrona. I've been here since 2001. Background in design and construction.
Thank you. Mr. McBroom.
I'm Tom McBroom. I am a civil engineer. I have an MBA. Spent most of my time in corporate finance, doing construction budgeting and planning, site acquisition, capital approval, that sort of thing.
Thank you. And Mr. David.
Hello, my name is George David. I've lived in St. Helena for 25 years. My background is totally related to real estate in the areas of finance, development, construction, consulting, advisory work. I am retired, and I refer to myself as a retired real estate investment banker.
Thank you. Mr. Keneally.
I'm Pat Keneally. I've lived in St. Helena, I guess now 8 years. I'm a media executive and a venture capitalist.
Thank you. Now we'll move to item 6, which is overview of Brown Act and Parliamentary Procedure. Item 6.1, Parliamentary Procedure. Ms. Ueda, are you going to lead us in this discussion?
Good evening. I'm Kara Ueda, the city attorney. I think the parliamentary procedure piece, we're going to have the city manager speak to that when he gets to his portion. I'm primarily going to talk about the Brown Act, touch upon the Public Records Act, as well as conflicts of interest. The bulk that will be on the Brown Act. And I do have some slides which should be coming up. I'm going to start basically by just giving you a real introduction to the Brown Act. I could go on and on about the Brown Act forever, but I won't. The Brown Act is I'm primarily going to talk about the Brown Act, touch upon the Public Records Act, as well as conflicts of interest. The bulk that will... All right, so the intent of the Brown Act is for the people's business to be conducted in open and public. That means that you have your meetings in the public, you have meetings agendized, and people are allowed to comment. The Brown Act applies to both elected and appointed public agency boards, which includes both joint power agencies and some private organizations as well. So we seem to be having some technical difficulties. So what the slide would say is, what is a meeting? And a meeting is basically any gathering of a majority of the members of a legislative body who meet at the same time and place to hear, discuss, or deliberate upon any matter under the agency's jurisdiction. So whenever a majority of the members of a legislative body, meaning either the city council, the planning commission, or the task force, meet at the same time and at the same place to hear, discuss, or deliberate upon any matter that comes within your jurisdiction, that is considered a meeting. And the reason why this is important is because a quorum or more of the members of a body cannot meet without having an agenda. So a meeting can take place at a coffee shop, it can take place at a restaurant, it can take place anywhere, but it can't occur if there's a quorum and there isn't an agenda. Is there a question? Okay. Sure.
So yeah, the question I have is, if we have a subcommittee of 3 people, because this is a 7-person body, I assume we could meet on some subject. I like to use examples. Let's say it's the stormwater system, and this subcommittee studies the stormwater system and comes up with some conclusions on cost and schedule and whatever. I assume then we need to schedule a meeting, and then it becomes a public forum when the subcommittee reports to the overall committee. Is that accurate?
That's a great question. So the question is about how to form subcommittees, and it's tricky because there are 2 different types of subcommittees that could be formed. The first kind is called a standing subcommittee, and that is when there's less than a quorum. So in the task force case, that'd be 2 or 3 members of the task force. A standing committee is a subcommittee that has either a regular meeting schedule or has continuing subject matter jurisdiction. So, for example, if the city council were to have a 2-member budget subcommittee that met all the time and it never went away, it continually met year-round, that would be a standing subcommittee that would have continuing subject matter jurisdiction and would be subject to all of the Brown Act's requirements, agenda, public comment, and the like. However, if, for example, your task force were to form a subcommittee to look at one specific issue, and that task force subcommittee goes out, studies that issue, researches it, and then comes back and makes a recommendation to the full task force. And then upon making that recommendation, the subcommittee goes away, and it doesn't have a regular meeting schedule. It can meet on Friday afternoon at 3, Monday morning at 8:30, etc. Then that that subcommittee task force is not subject to the Brown Act. That's called an ad hoc subcommittee. And that ad hoc subcommittee can only be comprised of members on your task force. You can't bring in other members to have as a part of that subcommittee meeting. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. And this basically says, what is a legislative body? So a legislative body is any governing elected body of the city council, the board of supervisors, or a special district board. It's appointed bodies, the commission, this task force, other districts, joint powers authorities. And then we get into the standing committees, which we just talked about. And then what's not considered a legislative body is this temporary ad hoc committee, as long as there's less than a quorum and it doesn't have continuing subject matter jurisdiction or a regular meeting schedule. So that's basically the essence of who's covered as a legislative body. There are some exceptions to the Brown Act. So if, for example, a quorum or more of a legislative body goes to attend a conference, you can go to a conference and all attend and be in the same place and at the same room because there's a conference going on and you're there for educational or leadership purposes, etc. If there's a community meeting happening, either for a private nonprofit group or just a community meeting that's otherwise happening, a quorum or more can go to that committee meeting. We do advise, though, that you shouldn't all huddle in the corner if there are 3 of you on the council or, 5 or 6 of you on the task force. I mean, the same rules do apply. It's just that you all can be at these places at the same time. There isn't a magic number that you have to count, and then suddenly one person has to leave if you find that there's more than a quorum at this event. So any social or ceremonial occasion, ribbon cutting, grand opening of an event, you can talk to each other individually, but you do need to be careful because you may reach out to one person and pretty soon you all end up in one big conversation. You can talk to any one person individually without violating the Brown Act. And then any communication that you may want to have with each other generally should happen at a meeting. But there are some exceptions. So, for example, when a staff might send you a message that says there's a meeting coming up on this date and time, or they may send out a message that says here are some things of interest to you, that is a one-way communication that is going out to you. Under the Brown Act, if you all start responding to that communication, then you're creating a quorum basically outside of a regular meeting. So you can't all start responding, but you can be a recipient of one-way communication. And you can write back individually. Just don't reply to everybody because then you'll find yourself unwittingly involved in a communication outside of a public meeting. So the easiest thing that can happen is when people send out a one-way communication by email, and a meeting can occur by the use of technological devices. Meetings can occur via a phone call, they can occur via text and or email. And so what we want to avoid is getting into an email chain or a text chain or some big group discussion on email about an item that's coming up on your agenda, because that can be a meeting that takes place outside of a noticed public meeting. The public is not aware of it. They're not allowed to participate or allowed to comment. And so what those meetings are called, they're called serial meetings. So if we can go to the next slide. And a serial meeting can occur in one of 2 different ways. There's a daisy chain, which basically happens when one member decides that he or she has a great idea and then wants to communicate that idea to the second council member who says, what do you think about this? I really think this is great. Let's get some support on this. And then we're all going to talk about it. And we're all going to agree that this is how we're going to do this thing. And then that person then talks to member C and then gets their basic agreement that this is fantastic and this is how they're going to vote, et cetera, et cetera. And then as that keeps going, it's like the old game of telephone where somebody keeps contacting each other on and on down the line. And then pretty soon you end up with 5 or 7 members who have all basically heard the same thing. And then you all may have reached basically a collective concurrence at the end of the line that whatever happened at the beginning with member A, you're now at member E or whatever the 7th letter of the alphabet is, and then you're all basically on the same page about this item. That conversation should have happened in a forum like this at a noticed public meeting. The other way that it can happen is called a hub and spoke, where instead of happening serial in sequential order, one person, A, is in the middle, and council member or task force member A basically says, I'm really worried about this item that's coming up on the agenda. So I'm going to now reach out to all of my other fellow members on the task force or on the city council and get them to see things exactly my way. And so that person then picks up the phone and tries to get everybody to basically agree on an item or at least to, talk about it and see things their way. And so they are having that same type of meeting in this circle around by reaching out to all their other members or most of the other members around this circle. And that is another way that a serial meeting can occur outside of the Brown Act. So here's an example. During a commission meeting, 5 of the 7 members frequently looked down into their laps. A local blogger later asked if they violated the Brown Act by sending texts or emails to each other about agency business. So the question is, was the Brown Act violated? And in that instance, yes, if they were doing something about public business, then the Brown Act in this specific case would have been violated. So the best practices are to not, if we can go to the next slide, the best practice. Oh, sorry, I skipped one. So the same type of activity that can occur by text or by telephone or by email can also occur online. There is no law yet on this. So questions come up a lot as to whether or not commenting on Facebook, for example, can be a Brown Act violation, or any other social media platform, such as even a newspaper article comment section. People can start commenting, and it's possible that once people start commenting, you can have a quorum or more online, all talking to each other and basically letting each other's opinions be known online. And it is, we think, possible one day for a court to say that the Brown Act has been violated, because even though the forum may be considered open, if you will, because it's on the internet, it wasn't done pursuant to a notice public meeting. So the best practice is to not comment, but if you are commenting, just to be mindful and aware of what else is going on within that string. I mean, we hate to say, like, be the first person, but in actuality, like, if you are the first person, then you're likely okay. If you're the third or the fourth or the fifth, then it's likely not. And so it's, I think, unrealistic to expect people not to comment online about issues within their jurisdiction, but to the extent possible, you need to really be careful about who else is commenting online on a story or on an item. And so the best practices overall is to not hit reply all, especially to messages when they're sent out to the entire body, to a task force, to the council. There's a tendency to hit sometimes reply all. In our office, we have a little screen that pops up and says, are you sure you want to reply all? But I don't think most programs work like that. And so sometimes it's hard to remember which one is reply and which one is reply all. So do not send messages out to the entire body, to the commission or to the council or to the task force. There's a term that one of our clients used to have, which is called a Brown Act buddy, which is on a particular item. Like, you can talk to one person on a 5-member body like the council, but it's just that one person that you're sort of assigned to as the buddy. On a body that has 7 members, you can have maybe up to 2 different people that you can talk to. But other than that, you kind of limit yourself to saying, okay, I'm only going to talk to this one person or to these 2 people on this particular issue. And then that's a way of keeping within the confines of the Brown Act. And then finally, do not text or email during a meeting. So the next slide basically kind of tries to hammer this home, which is not reply to all the emails. And that's sometimes, yes. And then we go to the next slide, which is the types of meetings. The rest of this doesn't necessarily concern you as much. I just wanted to go over it because there is a distinction between a regular meeting and a special meeting. A regular meeting is a meeting that happens on a regular basis for the city council. Those regular meetings are the second and fourth Tuesdays of every month. For a special meeting like this one, it's really any other time and place other than a regular meeting. Regular meetings require 72 hours notice. Special meetings only require 24 hours notice. That's really the key difference, is that everybody generally knows when the regular meetings happen, and the special meetings happen really at any time when the room is available and when it's convenient for the legislative body to meet. If we can go to the next slide. This is an agenda posting requirement, 72 hours before a regular meeting, 24 hours before a special meeting. The agenda has to be posted continuously for that entire time and on the city's website. The agenda has to both put the time and the place, as well as a brief general description of each item of business. And then if we can go to the next slide, the agendas have to allow for public comment. So any person who wants to provide public comment on any matter within the body's jurisdiction is allowed to comment. We can place reasonable time restrictions on them in terms of only allowing 3 to 4 minutes, only allowing people to speak once on an item, etc. But public comment does have to be allowed at every meeting. Okay, we can go to the next slide. This is about teleconferencing. So as we've all become more technologically savvy, the Brown Act has been amended to allow for teleconferencing. However, a quorum has to be present within the city. So if there is a quorum who's all traveling for some reason and everybody wants to call in from a conference, that can't happen because a quorum has to be within the city. The agenda has to identify every single teleconference location. And then whoever is at that teleconference location has to physically take the agenda and tape it to the door or wherever it is that the teleconference meeting is happening. It can be difficult to fulfill this obligation, especially at hotels when cleaning staff like to take things down. But that's the requirement. Agendas have to be posted at every location, and the location has to be accessible to the public. So wherever the person is at, it can't be behind, a locked door, and it has to be accessible for ADA purposes. And so all votes have to be taken by roll call because it's not always easy to both hear both ways whether or not somebody is voting for or against an item when the meeting is held by teleconference. And then whoever is at this teleconference location does also have to allow for any member of the public to be there. So we don't necessarily recommend teleconferencing because there are a lot of logistical details to work through and kind of things to work through. It's possible to do it, but it is just a little bit more complicated to get it done. Okay, so a committee member is on vacation and wants to call into a meeting from his cell phone while driving in scenic North Dakota. Is this okay? No. So I was asked this question one time, and the answer is no, because it's really impossible for a person to allow the public to participate in this meeting unless they somehow, it's just not possible because you don't know where they're at and they're not in one fixed location. Okay, so that is it on the Brown Act, unless anybody has any questions about it.
Are there any questions at this point from the task force or council?
Okay, I want to quickly get into the Public Records Act and conflicts. The reason why is because the California Public Records Act basically is similar to the Brown Act in terms of having the values of being open and transparent. And the California Public Records Act applies to records that are in the city's possession. It's really in any form or type. So it's not only physical documents, but it's also emails, text messages, tapes, videos, audio files, etc. And there are a number of exceptions as to what is not disclosable under the Public Records Act. So if somebody makes a request for a public record, the city does not have to release matters pertaining to pending litigation or personnel matters or matters subject to the attorney-client privilege. So there are a number of exceptions, but for the most part, by and large, records are disclosable to the public upon request. If we can go to the next slide, there are some more examples of some of the exemptions, deliberative process, preliminary drafts, etc. And then there's at the bottom a catch-all exemption, which basically requires a balancing test between whether or not there's a private interest in disclosure versus a public interest in disclosure versus the city's interest in withholding the record. But the reason why this is particularly important for people who serve on both the council as well as any appointed bodies and commissions and task forces, etc., is because of a case that came down a few years ago out of San Jose. Because the question as to whether or not a person's emails and records were subject to the Public Records Act when the city did not physically have possession of those records hadn't really been answered until this Supreme Court case, California Supreme Court case, came down 3 years ago. Because when members who serve in particular on city boards and commissions send out emails, oftentimes those emails are sent out under personal email addresses, right? People may have their own Gmail or AOL or whatever other email account that they use, and they use that email address for both their own personal purposes as well as for official city purposes. And so it was never entirely clear whether or not those emails that pertain to official city business were subject to the Public Records Act, because the public record is defined as records that both relate to city business but also that are within the possession and control of the city. So if the city didn't have a record on its server, it didn't really have a way to go get that record without actually asking a person for their individual emails about city business. And so this case clarified that if there is city business that is being done on a personal email account, but it's about city business, that record is disclosable. And so our best advice to really everybody who is in this position is to either have a city email account or to figure out a way to differentiate official city business from personal business, meaning perhaps getting a separate email account and then just using that particular email account for city business. Because if there is ever a Public Records Act request, it makes everybody's lives a lot easier in terms of trying to sort through what are possibly, very large amount of emails within one person's inbox. And so we sometimes have had to go into people's inboxes and sort of sort through what we think is relevant and isn't relevant. And it's not a really fun or interesting task for any of us to have to do that. So that's our best practice in terms of emails and public records. And text messages are subject to public records disclosure as well. They are harder to capture, but they are also subject to the Public Records Act when they deal with city business. So anything that you do on your own personal, time in terms of trying to set up whatever types of, other business you're doing by email, if you're setting up lunches or just, going to parties or whatever you're doing that's not related to any work officially with the city, that is not subject to disclosure. It's just the emails and the records that relate to city business. Anybody have any questions about any of that? Okay. And then I want to quickly touch upon conflicts of interest. So this particular task force, I don't think is likely going to encounter the types of conflicts of interest issues that we sometimes typically do see, but I did just want to quickly run through the types of financial interests that can generate conflicts of interest. So under California law, the issues that I get concerned about for conflicts of interest are those that deal with financial interests. So to the extent that you may have a relative or a friend who is involved in a project, if that person doesn't have a financial interest to you, like if you're not invested in a business with them, or if you don't have any type of other financial issue, that is generally not considered a conflict of interest for legal purposes under California conflict of interest law. It is considered likely a conflict of interest for most people in terms of what they feel like is an ethical obligation to either disclose that relationship or to otherwise, perhaps recuse themselves depending on the situation and the person and the relationship. The types of interests that the law is mainly concerned about in this context, though, are financial interests, meaning sources of income, meaning real property interests, places that you may have invested in either in your own personal residence or in a business, a commercial building, any business investments that you may have, any of your personal finances. So if your personal finances would go up or go down as a result of a decision, as well as any gifts that are received. And so those are the types of financial interests that we're most concerned about. If you think you have a financial interest or a conflict of interest in a particular item, the best thing to do is to first identify it. And then as soon as you do identify what you perceive to be a potential conflict of interest, let us know as soon as possible. Because the absolute worst place to ask a conflict of interest question is basically exactly where you are right now, to the person who is either to me or to the person who might be filling in for me in that moment, because it's impossible to analyze a conflict of interest that quickly if you have a question about it. And so our best conservative advice in the moment would be to recuse yourself from the situation, because we can't fully digest and understand and provide you with a really comprehensive answer to the question. So again, it only applies legally. The conflicts of interest generally only apply to financial interests. There can be situations of bias that arise that we need to really carefully look at, but they apply to certain situations and likely are not going to arise in the task force situation. So I'm happy to answer any questions about any of this. I know I sped through it because I know you have other things to get through on your agenda.
Thank you. Are there any questions at this point, Mr. McBroom? Yes.
Yeah, in terms of the Brown Act, it seems to me the focus of this is letting people know, interested parties, that there's going to be a meeting, what it's about, where it's going to be, et cetera. Is there any requirement to publish meeting minutes or reports following the meeting where the public could find out that way what's going on?
That's a good question. So the question is about meeting minutes. The Brown Act doesn't have a requirement to publish minutes, after the meeting. So there's no Brown Act requirement to do so. There is, however, case law that's out there that says the minutes serve as the official record of what happened at a meeting. And so it's a good practice to have minutes and then to have those minutes later adopted at a subsequent meeting.
Okay. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. It was very informative. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we will move now to our next item, which is Council Rules of Procedure for Boards and Commissions, and I believe Mr. Prestwich is going to lead us in this discussion in 7.1 here.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, briefly, and the real meat and potatoes on tonight's agenda is coming in a couple of minutes. So briefly, we've provided you copies of 2 resolutions that have been adopted by the City Council that govern rules of procedure for boards and commissions. And with respect to Resolution 2019-16, I want to direct your attention to Section 3.3 of the attachment. This is on page 20 of these rules, and it speaks to a code of ethics and conduct. And essentially, what these series of guidelines provide is aspiration to practice civility and decorum in discussions and debate with each other, with members of the public, with the council, and other boards and commissions within the city. So we've provided this for you. There is a separate resolution, 2014-45, that also speaks to expectations regarding boards and commissions. And so those are simply resources for you tonight. And I'm happy to answer any questions about those.
Are there any questions at this point from the task force or the council? Okay,
and then as an attachment to the first resolution, there is a reference to formal rules of procedure, and the city uses Rosenberg's Rules of Order. That I think the most famous motion, of course, is the motion to adjourn each evening. So we'll look forward to that motion later tonight.
And in terms of looking at the council rules of procedure, these apply also to the committees and commissions as well?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, so no questions. Seeing no questions, we'll move now to the introduction, item 8.1, introduction of city staff and support resources. 8.1 is review of staff roles and resources. Mr. Prestwich will also.
Thank you, Mayor. So I wanted to take an opportunity to introduce to you the staff resources that will be available to you during this journey. And I want to begin with Priya Nixon. She's our assistant to the city manager. She's learning the iCompass production process tonight that our city clerk typically provides. And so she is being coached by our city clerk in the back here. And Priya is going to serve as our city clerk for all of our meetings. She will post agendas. She will work with me to prepare agendas, minutes, etc. Priya will be your point of contact as committee members for the city. What we'd like to do is create a single point of contact for this task force, and Priya will be that. So Priya's contact information is on the left column of the city's website, which is cityofsthelena.org. And on the left column, there's a link to all the city staff. But Priya will be your single point of contact. Supporting her will be myself, Mark Prestwich, the city manager. My contact information is there as well. And I'm anticipating that Priya and I will attend all of these meetings. We're also going to be supported by Mark Walsh. Mark is a certified public accountant and has worked in local government, serves as a CPA consultant to the city. And to provide a little relief to our limited finance staff, Mark will be assisting with some of the finance-related matters with this particular task force. And I'm not anticipating that our city attorney will attend most of these meetings, but if there is subject matter that moves into that realm, we'll work with Kara to assist on those types of matters. In terms of protocol for task force communications, it is helpful for us if we, again, use Priya as a single point of contact. Priya has put together a website link for us on the city's website. So if we go to cityofsthelena.org, and I don't know if we can quickly bring this up or not, but on the government, there are 3 headers at the top, and under government, there is going to be a column on the very far right, and at the bottom of that column is a link to this task force. And we've already we will populate that link with a direct link to each of the agendas. This is partly for your resource, but also for the public, as well as every document that we share with you during the course of this task force work. So everything in the agenda that you have in these binders, which Priya has put together for you, also is, if we go back one step real quick to show everyone again. So under government, your government, we click there, and on the very far right is the Financing Civic Infrastructure Task Force. Right above it is the Shape Committee resources, in case you wanted to see any of those. And if you scroll down a little bit farther, that will be the link. Every agenda will be linked here, hyperlinked to our agenda page, and every document that we share with you, and we've begun to put together a bibliography of resources, will be contained here. We've added an additional 8.3 item on here regarding communications with media. And when this task force selects its chair and its vice chair, my recommendation for the task force is to, if you receive a inquiry from the media, whoever that might be, to direct that inquiry to the chair, and in the case of the chair, direct that inquiry to Priya, who will work with me and or the mayor to determine how to work with the task force to appropriately respond to the inquiry. Doesn't mean that you can't individually speak with members of the media, but some order and discipline related to our communications, I think, will enhance the work that you're invested in. Are there any questions about any of the items I've covered under Section 8, Item 8?
Any questions? None? Okay. So we're now at item 9. This is review of task force responsibilities and expectations regarding final narrative product. Also, Mr. Prestwich will lead us into this. Item 9.1 is the review of Resolution 2019137.
So this is really the reason why we have a joint meeting today. We want to make sure that there's clear communication between the council and the task force with respect to their expectations for you. And so just to walk through each of the elements within the resolution, this will be number 1A through 1H. We want to just take an opportunity to make sure that you have your questions answered that may arise. And we do anticipate that we won't cover and anticipate everything tonight, but we'll do our best to improve the transparency of the communication. So 1A refers to a September 17th, 2018 City Council report, where the council organized the decision making that they would begin, and this follows the work of the Shape Committee, and it put the following work into 4 easy to understand phases, and that was really the beginning of phase 2. So phase 1 was the engagement with the public and research. Phase 2 was beginning the analysis that Noel and Tam and other studies were a part of, and we're in the middle of the third step in that process now, before some decisions are made and we advance to construction. That report is included, a copy of that report is included in your binder, and it's also been hyperlinked on the website.
Is that the one marked draft, or is there a final?
The draft refers to an attachment to that staff report. So what occurred that evening was the report included a draft strategy on advancing decision making, and the council, with a few minor changes, adopted that strategy. 1B refers to evaluation criteria and principles that have been approved by the City Council. Those are also included in your binders and included on the website. And the expectation is that the task force will consider the council-approved evaluation criteria and principles. And I may want to pause there, Mayor, and ask if any council member would like to emphasize any particular evaluation criteria that they were a part of approving.
Any thoughts from the council?
Isn't that 9.2? I mean, should we wait to get to that point?
It is. Okay.
We can circle back.
Okay. 1C will involve taking a look at the Nolan-Tam cost estimates and options presented to the City Council on November 12th. We anticipate bringing you a full comprehensive report at your next meeting. This also includes under D, the preliminary downtown streetscape cost estimates. We have information on that on a single page, which is very helpful in 3 different phases. E refers to an underground utilities master plan that is currently under development. This is a plan that's not as far along as some of the other work, and so these will be looser numbers on some of the investments that are needed with our critical assets. F refers to working with the city staff and the city manager to evaluate and update the city's long-range financial forecast. This is a forecast that we've been working on and introducing to the council for approval each year. It helps guide our long-term decision-making. I anticipate we will want to create a number of different scenarios this year that accommodate different perspectives, and we'll be working with Mark Walsh as well as our finance director, April Mitz, who's not with us tonight. The council has included a item related to consulting with the city manager and the police chief to discuss potential alignment and or synergies related to police department needs. So the police department building is next to City Hall. It is also a building that the council expects will come down at some point, and we at some point will need to plan for a replacement structure that meets the needs of the police department. And we anticipate providing either a subcommittee some additional information or the full task force with some additional background on some of the considerations related to the police department, as well as some ongoing studies that are underway today. Any questions on those? Okay. And then H, this refers to the final report that the task force will provide, and we want to make sure that we take an opportunity to answer any questions that the task force members have with respect to this guidance. So, first bullet point, evaluation of the city's financial capacity, financing vehicles, and revenue producing potential and options. We have had some studies and work done in this area. We have some information that we will share with you. In terms of financing vehicles, the council's had some conversations about different mechanisms, and we anticipate having additional time invested in drilling down on the issues that are included here.
Do you have any? Are there any other questions here on this section, Mr. McBride?
Yeah, I'm not sure this is appropriate for this section, but I'll fire away anyway. So in terms of the scope of the work of the task force, I want to understand that the expectation is that we will delve into the all of the finances of the city, including everything that's on the capital plan, or at least the stuff that's on the cusp of on the cusp of being done or not done. Are we looking at work that didn't make the cut for the budget but probably should be addressed? And I'm thinking, for instance, storm sewer investment. Let me just ask that outright, because I see in the budget there's funds to do a study for all the underground utilities, but there's no money in the budget except for 1% of the replace of the infrastructure, which is a 100-year replacement plan, which clearly is not going to work. So is that in our wheelhouse or not?
Okay, the way I would answer that, and I'd invite the council to add any additional clarification that they would like. I think the council's expectation is the focus is the general fund primarily. Doesn't mean that the wastewater and the water funds also don't enter into the equation from time to time, but most of the storm drains are a general fund obligation. The buildings are a general fund obligation. The streetscape has other resources that can help fund certain investments, but also would otherwise be a general fund obligation. And so the primary focus is the general fund versus the water or the wastewater fund.
And I think that brings up a important clarification just for everybody, that the general fund is separate from the enterprise funds, which are the water and the wastewater funds. And Mr. Walsh can help in clarification for folks about how those funds work. So
the Streetscape project does fall then under that, in the fact that I think it's a $1.2 million grant against a budget that's now $3 million in phase one, and I don't have it somewhere, $15 million for the whole project. Is that in our wheelhouse?
Yes. So it's $3.6 million for phase one, 3.1 for phase two, and another $8 million, I believe, for phase three. And so that's part of the wheelhouse of this group. I would also add that I think it's fair to say that we should acknowledge that, for example, our fire department, which is a beautiful hybrid, incredibly affordable fire department, is a department in transition. And because it's a department that probably, fair to say, saves us, my current estimate is $1.3 million a year. When we contrast our costs with other cities, it's an extraordinary model. It's probably fair to say, the most affordable, that delivers the best quality within the I would argue that it's as competitive as any department in the state. But if it continues to transition to a full-time department, and we have 2 full-time firefighters today, but we've never retired a firefighter, it will cost more money to operate that department longer term, and it's something we need to keep an eye on. And of course, we want to sustain the current model as long as possible. But other departments that previously were volunteer have transitioned to full-time departments in recent decades. But that's an example of just the bigger picture on the general fund, because that happens to be a general fund obligation.
To the extent that your bigger picture is well defined, our job is easier. And if the sort of revenue side of the finances are a little fuzzy, and the priorities are a little fuzzy, and the length of the list is a little fuzzy, to what extent do you guys want to get firmer for us, or do you want our help in helping you prioritize? Because if you said, do phase one, the top 4 items within a budget of this, the city thinks its basic capacity is this, I think we could vet that or not pretty quickly. But if it gets too squishy, I wonder that we'll spin our wheels a little bit.
I guess let's start with the buildings, for example, first, because on the buildings, the council has clearly already prioritized the buildings at the moment, and those would be the City Hall, library, and a possible community or recreation facility. And those are the 3 buildings that they exclusively focused on at this time. There are other buildings, and we've added a reference to the police facility. And there are other buildings, though, that we know are in conditions that require investment, and those are not buildings that I'm anticipating will be part of the calculus here. And if the council would like to add clarity to the question of, for example, Signorelli Barn or other buildings that we own, that would be helpful.
Thanks. I'm sorry, is it Mr.
Pat is correct.
Pat. They like us to be formal up here. So how do you pronounce your last name? Keneally. So, Mr. Keneally, from my perspective, and I speak for myself on the council, not for the other 4 members, but option generation is always better than just answering a question. And you guys are experts, and there's a lot of experts, and you'll have a chance to work with Mr. Walsh. And there are others out there that I hope will speak to you about sizing and ways to mitigate cost. I just want us to think that we're not in a box. For example, there are 3 hotel proposals that are in various stages of winding their way through the planning department. Those could have a significant impact on our revenue in future years from a TOT tax perspective. And I would hope that there's not a one answer that solves this. I think there's a variety of looks, and I hope that you guys will have a chance to surface those types of options for us. So I think it's
that was
less.
My question is, you want us to look sort of at the revenue side and the cost side?
Yeah, I would. I mean, that's my opinion.
Any other thoughts from the council?
I think we have to remember what brought us all here, which is primarily the civic buildings. So when I hear you talking about the fire department, I don't expect this group to get into a discussion about the fire department. That's going to be sort of a reserve number in the general fund that you're not allowed to tinker with. That it would be there. And as far as hotels, yeah, it's not a question of which one you prefer or would like or don't like. It's a matter of what are the revenue implications of each of them to the city in terms of TOT or property tax could also be a significant issue. And so it's not weighing in on, I really like Ted Hall's project, for instance. It's really line them up and what does it provide to the city?
I guess my question, just to use that example, if the city has a fundamental choice between increasing its debt level or selling assets, to me that's a political decision, not an economic decision. We can get you more facts or maybe more precise facts than we've read about in the newspaper, but in the end, the amount of debt you're willing to take on it's a political question. It's not a we can recommend to do the following 4 things is going to cost you at least X and make recommendations on how to come up with the money. Or we can say the amount of money is blank and here's how much you got, for that budget. Or we could do some mix of the two, but I just was pointing out that when you're doing both of those simultaneously, it gets necessarily more fuzzy and it gets out of the realm of experts and into the realm of political will.
But the idea of the task force is a recommending body, an advisory body, and we want to take your expertise and your perspective as advisory. I recommend to folks to look through a lens of municipal finance. You can go to the League of California Cities. Michael Coleman is an excellent resource that you can track down through the League of Cities. And also, there's a website. It's californiacityfinance.org, Mr. Presswich?
.com, I believe.
.com. And so in considering how finance looks in the private sector and then how it looks in the municipal sector, and then we want your expertise. We believe we prioritize civic buildings, so trying to keep it somewhat focused towards that. We know what we're trying to get work towards City Hall Library as priority. The other things are important, but are not at the top of the list right now. Any other thoughts from that, Council?
No, I just think that the community space has to come back into the question if we're talking about selling other buildings and then we no longer have the community space available that we now use for Park and Recs, because that is split up in all of our different buildings. So I just want to be mindful of that.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Okay, so with that, we will move now on to...
Let me cover a couple of the other bullet points here. There's the third bullet point, project and financing phasing timelines. So the anticipation is that there may need to be project phasing and certain projects and amenities would need to be parked for a while or phased in a way that facilitates the funding of these investments. site selection has been included if relevant, because I think the council's anticipating that it may be relevant to certain considerations. We will be sharing with you a status update on the council's most recent conversations about options that they've narrowed this down to, and we're currently analyzing the cost of a new option that was added at the prior the council meeting that we previously talked about that. So that is also something that the council's asked for, and I don't know if a council member would like to add any context to that bullet point.
Since you're looking at me, I'll add the context. Again, it's a matter of, from a financial perspective, how does the selection of a site make a difference? If you put this, if you leave the city hall where it is, for instance, versus put it somewhere else, not what your personal view is about where it should be, but what kind of financial implications does it have, or how does it relate to some of these criteria that we're going to talk about next, other things that we think are important?
Any questions?
Yeah, I've got a question on that. What I read in the St. Helena Star was different than what I heard at this meeting on some of the infrastructure stuff on the buildings. And so I guess my question is, how does our task force keep up to date if something like that comes up and we read something in the paper and it's not what we heard elsewhere? Do we just go to Priya as a start and say, here's something I've heard that is in conflict, or
Priya is the
not
point of
clear?
contact, and I
Okay.
think that's where we go for clarification. She's in direct communication with the city manager. That if you read something different in the newspaper, to me the city, the word from the city is where you need to go to get the direct statements. So whatever is out there in the public, I as a personal practice always go through the office of the city manager, which Priya is representing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree with that, and if you see conflicts or conflicting information that you'd like some clarity on, simply work with us and we'll make sure that you get the accurate information. If we have inquiries from a member of the task force, it's possible that we will send you an email that says we've received a question and here's the answer to that question. The staff may want to take the opportunity to share the answer with all of you, because if one person's asking it, you may all be interested in it and we would want to share that equally. So I do anticipate that there will be situations like that. And then if you have questions there and you don't reply all, you simply send us an email or better yet, telephone us.
And I'll mention social media as well, that word gets out in social media, whether it's Facebook, Nextdoor. For clarification, always go to the city to find out where the city's point is.
Okay, the final bullet point here, I'm going to elaborate a little bit on and invite council members to add additional clarification. Refers to the approach to architectural design and process. For example, consideration of environmental elements. And the council, in their conversations, have emphasized an interest in environmental stewardship and high-quality environmentally sustainable buildings. And so we understand that there's a premium to those types of buildings. I believe it was 5 or 10% premium that Nolan Tam added to that, but that has been a conversation of the council. Maintenance considerations. We've been on some site visits and looked at other buildings and understand our own buildings. The way you design a building also sometimes impacts its maintenance. So to the extent the building can be designed in a way that limits the maintenance requirements for the building, that helps us long term, because we have then the opportunity to invest fewer staff hours in shining up certain windows that maybe are invitations to birds and you name it. It's if we can achieve minimalization of the investment in the maintenance, it really saves us time and money longer term. Materials, This can be a couple of different, I think, interpretations. Are there materials that are more affordable? Are there materials that are more sustainable? Are there materials that will produce an extraordinarily elegant building versus a more simple approach to buildings? I think that this is a reference that's a little more open to interpretation, and a council member may want to elaborate on that. And then with respect to process associated with the design phase, in my mind, this refers to, are we comfortable, if we're thinking about buildings, are we comfortable moving forward with, if there was an interest in moving forward with design, formal design of a building, is the recommendation to continue work with Nolan Tam, to go out to RFP, or to consider a design competition or something along those lines?
Other thoughts from the council?
Well, again, I think that's a financing thing. It's ultimately the council's choice whether we're going to continue with Nolan Tam. But if you feel there are good reasons to get into a competition from a financial perspective, fine. And I would just mention on the environmental, I think you always have to think about the end product, and do you have reduced operating costs from a particular building if you've designed and built it a certain way? And sort of in this big ballpark altogether is, what's the cost and benefit of renovation versus new construction?
Additional?
Yeah, just the other point with the environmental is that cities are often the ones that set the standard for environment, and there was interest on this council for doing that, and now we want to see if we can afford it for consideration.
Thank you. Mr. Knudsen?
Another piece of background on that was our long path to getting a toilet off of Money Way, and the initial design went out to bid, and it was incredibly expensive because guess what? We had all the environmental bells and whistles and other sort of fancier design aspects, and then we went with a pre-built unit, much, much cheaper. So I do think finance will play a role in this decision that we end up making.
Okay. Mr. Presley, any further?
I think that's good.
Okay, so we'll move on now to item 9.2. This is review of council approved civic infrastructure evaluation criteria and principles. And this is on page 123 of the report.
So I briefly referred to this when speaking with a prior resolution, and these are principles that really had their start with a SHAPE committee. The council has added to those a little bit, clarified a few items, and there may be council members that want to provide some context on some of the principles that they've adopted here.
Any thoughts from the council? Seeing none here, well, are there questions from the task force on the criteria? Mr. Wallach?
I'm lost.
Oh.
Where is this in our binder?
So it's going to be an attachment to the implementing resolution. Is
Yes,
that right?
it's right after the implementing resolution. There should be a piece of colored paper, and then it will be right after that, and it's just a one-page handout.
I have page 123. Am I seeing that the same as everybody?
It looks like this. It's a one-page document.
So this is the criteria that the council came up with.
I think we have a draft version of what you've got.
Okay.
There's stamp draft.
Yeah, this is it. That's it.
So if you haven't had a chance to review this,
I think it's substantially the same.
okay.
It is.
Okay. Any thoughts? Any questions? Okay. So with that, then we'll move on to section 10. This is selection of task force chair and vice chair. My recollection is that we as a council had decided that we would ask the task force to appoint their own chair. Am I correct in that? So the process for that, Mr. Prestwich, would be?
So that option is available tonight, or alternatively at the beginning of your next meeting. But we would expect that the chair would then manage the agenda and work through the next meeting agenda along with a vice chair in case of the absence of the chair. So we've placed that on the agenda for tonight. There is a possibility for you to take action. There's also an option to postpone this to your next meeting.
My thought is to ask the group if they've gotten to know each other well enough to have this discussion tonight, or if it's more prudent to push it to the next meeting and have you make the decision at the next meeting after you've had a little time together.
Okay. I really had noticed to get here.
Okay.
Please use your microphone. Thank you.
So shall we have a motion, Mr. Doring? Is that your suggestion?
It's a matter of a little bit of trust. I mean, we can have a number of get-togethers. I don't think we're ever going to be to a point where you're going to be totally comfortable with who it is that you pick. It's just sort of a gut check here. I would recommend that someone volunteer to make a motion and appoint somebody. If you're all, and if it doesn't get anywhere, it doesn't get anywhere. Or we could do it for you. We just thought that, you had a chance to be interviewed. Obviously, it's limited discussions, but I would entertain a motion for somebody and a second from somebody to appoint a chairperson. It's up to you, and the votes will show where they are. I think we need to move forward on it as quickly as possible, but if there's discomfort there, then I recognize that also.
Is there a motion for a nomination?
I would suggest you kind of look at this kind of like a jury thing where you get in the room, you sit around with each other, and we can come up with that and close that really quickly. I don't think this horseshoe is really the productive venue to do that properly.
Let us commit to coming out of the first meeting with it.
Yeah.
Please use your microphone.
I'm comfortable with that. With Ms. Doring, are you comfortable with that?
That's fine.
Okay.
And these.
That's okay.
I have a question, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, Mr. McBroom.
So I think it would be a good idea for us to get together alone if we can. It depends on the Brown Act, restrictions.
No, and the challenge here is you don't have that opportunity. This decision will be made in this room at the beginning of the next meeting, and you're limited to your conversations up to 3 people, up to 2 others. So a total of 3.
I'm aware of that. So the situation you have 5 or 7 people and we're all together who have never met each other. Well, a few of us have, but most of us have never met each other before tonight. For this to be an effective choice for the group, we need to get to know each other a little bit and find out what our strengths are and what we want to do. And I think appointing person certainly would work, but probably wouldn't be the best choice.
I'll provide another alternative is that I would facilitate your meeting agenda until later in the evening at your next meeting, at which point you would entertain a motion to appoint a chair. But essentially what that would mean is I would be working through the agenda, and we have a draft of what that looks like, and we will be looking for comment and feedback on the draft agenda later tonight. But another alternative would be to use me as a facilitator until you make that decision. But I would recommend that you place that on your next agenda, if not making that decision tonight.
Maybe we could just talk a little bit about what the role of the chair is, what the responsibilities are. I mean, you're basically going to work with the staff to create the agenda. You run the meeting. You might be deciding when to bring the subject matter experts in. And then there would be a vice chair who would be assisting whoever happens to be the chair. I had a question about whether we were required to ratify this, which is why I sort of thought it was going to happen tonight.
Ratify
the choice. Didn't we?
It doesn't have to.
Okay.
I think we anticipated that the task force would want to make a decision either tonight or we have the flexibility to place it on the next meeting.
Right,
as
but the
well.
council doesn't need to ratify it?
Not that I don't believe so. And alternatively, the council has the choice of making that decision themselves, as opposed to delegating that decision to the task force.
Mr. Knudsen?
Personally, I prefer not to make a choice for you. I'd rather you guys made a choice, and it strikes me that City Manager Prestwich is offered to chair the meeting until you decide at a later moment. I mean, everybody has an equal voice on this. It's really about sort of managing, just as Mr. Mayor manages these meetings. It's really about managing the meetings and working with our city staff. It really is.
So that's something to consider for that role, and as Ms. Coberstein mentioned as well. So my comfort level is with coming out of the next meeting with the chair and allowing the group to have the process themselves to find a chair rather than being appointed by the council. I'm okay with it waiting until the next meeting. Is there a comfort level on the council with that?
Fine.
Okay. Okay. So then we're going to move to the preliminary discussion of task force meeting timeline and schedule.
So this is described as a preliminary discussion because we anticipate you'll want to talk a little bit tonight. We may need to do a little polling to determine people's schedule and availability. We have one member not with us tonight. So when the council adopted the resolution that created the task force, there was an expectation that the work of the task force would take approximately 3 months, with the idea that meetings would occur every other week. The formal gathering that we have here tonight, think of this as your bonus meeting. You get a freebie. So maybe 6 additional meetings, as well as an expectation that some of the work would happen through ad hoc subcommittees. And ad hoc subcommittees are committees that I think facilitate a more accelerated approach to tackling certain issues. And what we recommend is consideration of Mondays, Wednesdays, or Thursdays as optimal days, partly driven by the availability of this room. We do have some limitations, I believe, on Thursdays once a month. And there's also a consideration of, is this a daytime meeting or is this an evening meeting? We can use the room at both times, but it requires coordination with the school district. And so it would be helpful if we're looking at an every other week meeting schedule to pick a Monday, a Wednesday, or Thursday, knowing that Thursdays have some potential limitations on one evening a month. And I believe, is that the 4th Thursday? We're not sure. Third or fourth Thursday. So I'll pause there and
Can we just go around the room and
let's just
have
do a
each
show of
person say what their limits are and see if we can't come up with something?
Mr. Prestwich, what do you believe is the best method here?
I think it would be helpful to understand what limitations, if any, task force members have with their schedules.
Okay, so if we start on your side here and we'll just work around.
I'm retired. I'm available on Monday, Wednesday, or Thursday, anytime.
You're chairman.
No. I'm unvolunteering for that.
I am working more than full-time, but I can make myself available as needed. There are maybe one Monday that I probably can do it. But other than that, and I can do daytime or evening as long as it's local.
I'm pretty flexible. I can do Monday, Wednesday would be my preference. Daytime or evening, as long as we have a heads up, I can make it happen.
Yeah.
I'm pretty flexible. I think I have Napa County Community Foundation, which selects Wednesdays, but those are usually morning. So if we do evening, I'm totally clear. And if we do midday. I said most of the days, Monday, or if it's Monday and Wednesday, or Monday and Thursday would be okay. Yeah. I can make it work.
I'm always gone the first Thursday and Friday of the month. Other than that, I'm relatively flexible, and I will say that I prefer daytime meetings, mainly because I'm just better during the daytime.
Thank you.
Probably Mondays are very tough for me, just in the cyclicality of my business. I prefer Thursday or Wednesday, probably after 3. That's daytime.
Okay.
I'd like this quorum at Wednesday.
Wednesday at 3?
Pardon?
Is Wednesday at 3 the commonality we've got? Does that work for everybody?
So when would be the first meeting?
And by the way, I think when we think about, from a staff perspective, when we're thinking about the duration of your meetings, where our plan is to build you agendas in the 90-minute, hour and a half to 2.5 hour realm. Once it hits that third hour, it gets a little long. So a 3 o'clock meeting we would expect would adjourn at 5 or 5:30. Okay. And looking at the calendar, and then I guess I would also let you know that optimally what we prefer to do is try to post the agenda, develop and post the agenda and any materials. The law says at least 72 hours before the meeting, if it's a regularly scheduled meeting. We endeavor to do that a little earlier, and I think with this committee, we would endeavor to publish about 7 days out optimally. Sometimes we have people that are absent or away, and it's a little difficult because we have a limited staff. And so I'll need some flexibility on the publication date. When I look at a calendar on a Wednesday, that could be potentially the 12th or the 19th.
I would personally prefer the 12th.
Same.
Yeah, it's vacation week, I think, the 19th, right? For kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Monday's a holiday.
Ski week.
So we're looking at 3 o'clock on Wednesday the 12th?
So I'm going to look to the city clerk briefly to determine if we think there's any conflict on that day, or whether we need to make a phone call to the school district tomorrow. Telephone call? Okay, so I think we can consider it a hold at 3 o'clock on the 12th for now, but we'll need to confirm the availability of the room. And the reason that we prefer this room is it's very easy to videotape these meetings for the public. Otherwise, we have to pay a hefty premium to videotape at other locations. And so our plan would be to come back on the 12th at 3 p.m.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so with that, we will move on to item 12. This is discussion of draft agenda for next meeting. Mr. Presswich, will you take us through this?
So this is a sketch, and we're looking for feedback from the task force. But we believe you need a status report on the buildings, City Hall, the library, the street, and the other projects, the streetscape projects, the storm drains, and other general fund obligations. It may be helpful to provide a municipal finance overview. So we've shared with you at your prior interview that website. You may have taken a look at the complexities of municipal finance. Myself and Mark Walsh are available to answer questions that you may have. We think that could be valuable for you. Why don't I run through this briefly, and then we'll take some questions and decide on agenda. We think that it's helpful to provide you background on the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District conversations that the council's received information on, as well as public-private partnerships and other revenue sources. So that may be other ways that the city raises money, or perhaps we discourage opportunities related to other revenue sources. An example of that might be the city's hotel tax probably doesn't have any, does not have a lot of financial capacity, and the number is 13% today. The highest in California is 15%, but that doesn't generate a lot of additional revenue. And it generally requires a lot of political capital to move a measure to a ballot. 12.4 reserves a conversation about the possible creation of ad hoc subcommittees. One example may be a long-range financial forecast subcommittee that can work with the staff to advance a number of alternatives that you're thinking about. And so that may be one of many different ideas you have related to subcommittee work. And this may be, by the way, too ambitious of an agenda as well. We think we may have stumbled tonight on the task force work plan. I think if we do a little research and try to build out an every other week schedule for you and confirm that with a school district, we can leave this on as a quick item that allows you to forecast your future meetings and confirm those. And then we want to we're recommending that we reserve a conversation for what information do task force members need. We are already receiving questions. We're inventorying all of those questions, and we anticipate you may want to send us, I will invite you to send us questions that you have now so that we can bring you back that inventory at the next meeting, and also invite additional questions that you have. So we think that's a full agenda with those items, and we're happy to talk about what else could or should be added or edited from this current draft list.
So first I want to check in with the council. Are there any thoughts on this list here? Mr. Doyle?
Just a point of clarification. So, for example, 12.3, discussion of enhanced infrastructure financing district, public-private partnerships, and other revenue sources. That to me is a really big discussion. So I guess the question would be, if we were to go forward with that on the next meeting, would that be an initial discussion, and then maybe subsequent meetings would get more into the detail? I just think that in and of itself could be a whole meeting, frankly, and it probably needs to be set up where we invite somebody who has the expertise to deliver the information to us. So my preference would be an introductory session, and then maybe later in one of our subsequent meetings it would be more in-depth. And you could say that, I guess, to all of these issues, but what is your thinking on that?
I think that reflects my thinking as well. I know that we spent several hours talking about EIFD and the nuances of how it may work or help the city. And I do think that some of these areas are also ripe for a subcommittee to really spend a little bit more time tackling and analyzing and bringing back information and reports to the broader task force, and EIFD may be one of those. But I think Mark and I can provide a higher level overview of some of these issues, and I'm also anticipating that we're going to provide you some written materials that will be presented with the with the task force agenda, that can provide you some background in advance of the meeting, so you're not just hearing it for the first time at the meeting.
Any other? Okay, just a moment. And we're looking at a total of, in terms of work plan timeline, a total of roughly 6 meetings. Is that the?
That's what we're anticipating. I mean, that's the goal, is that we can have this task force chew on the challenges and offer recommendations to the council within about 3 months.
Okay.
But we don't have a drop deadline for you formally, but the goal is 3 months.
Okay. Mr. McBrim, did you have?
Thank you. I guess I'll show you my civil engineering roots here, but I'm concerned about other projects that could eat up the available funds or available borrowing capacity. And the storm sewer, in 12.1, you say you're going to give us a status of the storm drains. There's plenty of empirical evidence that those things are falling apart. They're all aging at the same rate. We've already had holes open in the street. I mean, it's very likely that we're going to have major investment there. I understand that you are commissioning a study. Someone's going to do an underground video, I think, of the sewer system, but also the storm sewer system. So my question is, how are we going to know as a task force what the condition of that storm sewer is and what it's likely to chew up in terms of financial resources if you haven't done the study yet?
Right. I think that's the challenge. Is we're probably not at a point where we have great data yet, other than age data that can generate some analysis. But we don't have TV video for a lot of infrastructure that would then lead to a review of cracks here and cracks there, and an estimate of what that repair cost is, and a prioritization of which are the most critical assets to invest in now. So I think of all of the various ambitions all of the items that we have listed here, the storm drains are the one that is going to be the last to the party in terms of its data. I can tell you that I would immediately guess north of $2 million, and it wouldn't surprise me if the analysis said $5 million. But we don't have those numbers yet. It's too early to forecast that, and it will depend on additional analysis. But we have a number of different studies that are happening, and they're happening at different times and paces.
The only thing I would add to that is there are secondary problems associated with that. As water escapes those drains, and I've seen them, they're wide open. I mean, the whole top's missing off these drains. It's flooding the sanitary system, or that's part of what's happening to the sanitary system, which is overloading the sewage treatment plant, which is leading to a bunch of violations and fines and other things. So we may find that it is a fairly high priority. Not only is it going to be expensive, but it's going to be a very high priority. And for the task force is how much of our funding / borrowing capacity is going to be eaten up on a must-do item like that.
So I think that we'll get into the weeds as we get deeper in. That's the sort of the idea of the task force, is to look at where we are. So as we get deeper in.
I understand, Mayor. The only question I had was on this 12.1 for the agenda for next week. I don't know how much information we're going to be able to get on that.
Well, I think part of information is telling you what we don't have information on. And we can provide you an update of what data we have. We're close to a status report, and I haven't had a touch base meeting with our engineer recently, and so the Public Works Director is aware that I'm expecting a briefing on that shortly.
Mr. Knudsen?
I had a comment that sort of came and flew by. It would be very helpful for me if the group could help to understand what a public-private partnership actually might mean. It's been bandied around, but what is the give to get? For example, the school district had a public-private partnership proposed to have a private group put in solar on the parking lots, and they ended up not electing to do it because it seemed to be very weighted towards the private compared to the public. So I would be very curious as to what those options might be and what that might look like, because and that's the other thing from the EIFD, for example. I'm also very curious about how that might impact, if you're putting a group of properties into a particular infrastructure district, what does that mean about the control of those of that property tax, where the increase is particularly put into this item? We sort of explored that a little bit 8 or 9 months ago, but having greater specificity about the costs and the benefits associated with that would be very, very helpful. Because there's downsides and there's upsides, and as we figure that out. The other thing is sort of a carrying capacity of the town. The town has basically no debt right now, so it's in an extremely good financial condition currently. On the other hand, we have these assets are in poor shape. So, at any rate, it'll be interesting to see what you guys learn. Thank you.
Mr. Wallach?
Just a little more on storm sewer, but I need to understand how we move forward on some of these items. And so on the news was the identical situation in Oakland a week ago, saying that they've got 3 times the amount of water coming into their system during storms. So I guess my question is, how do we find out what other cities have done so we don't reinvent the wheel? Or there may be others that are further down this process than we are. How does this committee move forward? If we think we need more information, how do we do that?
One of the things we have access to are some tremendous resources with our city staff, Mr. Walsh, the League of Cities. We don't have to invent new wheels, so to speak, but I do think we have to be aware of what other cities have done, good practice, best practice, precedent. So the task force can be proactive in looking at other cities, also working with our city staff to find out what is good precedent. So I think that's what you're tasked to do is begin this process. We don't have all the information. We are gathering information, and we work with the best information we have, and that's why bringing in folks like you who have a background in analyzing information is important to us to help give us, provide recommendation. Yes, ma'am.
But we're not asking you to re-engineer the storm source system. We're asking you to come up with a realistic estimate, if you can, of within the time that you have to do the work, of what this costs and how it can be phased or how it can be paid for. And I would hate for it to become the lead item on your list, because we're really here talking about buildings. And we can talk about this more later, but I do believe there might be another revenue source for storm drains. I want to talk about public-private partnership, because people use that word and they mean different things. And there are some publications around, but a public-private partnership is a way in which communities all over California are funding civic buildings, and particularly long neglected assets that are overdue for work. And so I would encourage you to, the staff will provide you some material, but basically what it is that somebody else builds the building for you, participates in the design and the bidding, but they build the building, they assume the risk that the costs are going to go up, and then they maintain the building, usually for maybe 30 years. And you are making payments to that developer, if you would call it that, to cover the cost and basically cover a fee. And so it is a method of building civic infrastructure that's intended to reduce the risk to the city of things like cost overrun and maintenance responsibility for the near term. There are other public-private partnerships where private parties get involved with the government in doing things, but in this context, it's a particular way of constructing projects that can have benefits, and maybe people will find it has some negative aspects for the city.
Jeff? I suspect that we all have a different level of information and understanding of the financial aspects of the city. And I think it would be very valuable to you to require us, and I know you mentioned this, I'm just trying to emphasize it, that we give you feedback short term as to what information we want or we feel we need, and prioritize that information based on what we know and what we don't know. And I think that the sooner we can do that, the more effective we can be. And I'd add a second thing, and that is overwhelm us. I'd rather have the information than not have the information. And please don't be concerned about our falling behind. That's our responsibility, and we'll handle it. But the more we have, the better.
That's exactly the question I was about to ask, is can we give you a few things now that, would help us get off to a flying start? And a few I could rattle off is, has the city engaged some kind of municipal finance consultant to give an estimate of current borrowing capacity?
Yes.
We'd love to see that data. And, is there a pre-existing sentiment on the city council about aversion to debt, neutrality to debt. Are we budget hawks? I mean, we should have some kind of context, I feel, for that.
So
what you read in the press around here is very
Well,
hysterical on both
right.
ends.
So I think it's important that we stay focused on the communication we're having with the city, and the newspaper does their job, and we do our job. I think we can learn a lot about how those balances work through conversations with staff, Mr. Walsh, understanding municipal finance as opposed to private finance. This, to me, is what you're here for. And as much as you can ask of what you want, we might not vet it all out here tonight, but you have access now to staff to ask those questions for what you believe you need to see. And as Mr. Knudsen said, option generation and showing us options, not 1,000 options, but enough options that we can look at variations. And we know that we must move forward with a new city hall. That's our priority. We want to look at how everything else balances, but we have a priority to look at city hall, look at library renovations, or rebuilding library. Those are our priorities. So that's where this task force we're trying to get.
And we'll provide you some additional materials right away for homework, including all of our finance policies, which are located on the website under the finance department. And the administrative policy, which I think is number 16, includes a reference in section G10 to actually a government code limitation. So sometimes we're going to find that our ability to borrow is limited by government code requirements. And you'll learn other nuances, such as the storm drain that's a problem on Main Street is not the city's obligation, it's Caltrans's obligation. And there are going to be a lot of nuances as we move through this process.
Mark, are you planning on having Ken Deeker give a condensed version of his? In the summer, we did get a presentation from a municipal finance consultant who's worked with the city a lot. Helped us through the water rates, figuring out the bonding for that. I think the answer to the debt question is there's going to have to be some debt to do some of this work, and the question is, what's the source of the funds that are paying that debt? There are different ways and different ways to layer it in, and different types of debt. Is it coming from the general fund, or is it coming from your real estate taxpayers, or where is it coming from?
It could be very...
That's just my view about
it's
that.
Probably would be very helpful for us to look back through the last year and a half of presentations and inventory those for you, so that you can watch those meetings and see that, and have copies of the material that's already been provided, and some really good conversations.
I think the EIFD one might not have been taped.
That's true. Not
But
all
we
of
do
them.
have a some kind of a report and presentation, I think, from that meeting. And there
Sure.
must be some article somewhere.
Mr. Wallach?
So I think I'm hearing that we're going to get a pre-read, and Preya, will you tell us when, email us so we know when that's available to pick up?
Okay.
Okay.
When that information comes, it will generally come in the form of posting an agenda. Although with some of the early information gathering, we may send you just emails with links, and then later reference that at the public meeting that we've created this database for you and what's
Okay.
been shared.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Knudsen?
We also have a tremendous resource in Mr. Walsh, who is in this room and is part of your options for engaging. He's a municipal finance expert who has understood the city of St. Helena's financing historically against today, and also does a bunch of work for other cities, and so really can put us in context. And yeah, I'm very happy that you're here.
Mr. Walsh, would you be able to come up for just a moment and just give a quick...
So on item 12.2, municipal finance interview, that could mean so many things. It could feel overwhelming. So to add structure to that, and have some consistency and comparability in the discussions over time. My intention is to walk through the comprehensive annual financial report, and that sets the context within everything that's reported in a standardized format in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. So if we do some homework and I walk through that, and I'll try to use lay terms, it'll give us a common understanding and common vocabulary for what is general fund balance. What are the other funds, and can any of that money be spent on capital items? So that would be sort of a start. And then the things that are on those balance sheets that are standardized, you say, what about cash? What about infrastructure? What about debt? So maybe we could use that as a context for the municipal finance discussion, because the item could overwhelm me as well. But and then for the budget, we use the budget. I'll walk through the budget cycle. So what is a budget? How is it adopted? And who has the real decision-making authority? For example, department heads request a budget after hearing the limitations that the city manager will accept in their recommendations. So that's a requested budget. Then the city manager will recommend a budget to a governing body, the council. The council reports, propose it to the citizenry. Only, and then they hear from the citizens, and then they adopt it. So I'll go through the basics of the budget, but we'll have the document so you can see what the limitations are and what we were thinking when we made those budget recommendations before. And then you'll be more familiar with the budget hearings. You'll be able to see those online. And the financials will just give us context. So that's what I was thinking on 12.2 would be our start. And I'll try not to take too much time with it. And then all those documents have been public information for a long time, and you can see backwards, and we'll feed those into the projections, and then you'll be able to see forwards what the projections are based on our assumptions.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Are there any other points, Mr. Prestwich?
Well, it would be helpful for the task force to confirm that this draft agenda looks good, since we don't have a chair to work with. I'll be working on this with our staff.
I just have one addition, and that is in 12.1, you mentioned that we have hotel proposals that are working their way through the city. Is there a way for us to find out where those are and what their likelihood of approval is and what the revenue associated with that is?
We can provide a general overview, and I think one of the nuances to your question is also one of the questions that we received this week or last week related to what is the hotel revenue from a certain hotel in town, and we can't provide you that information. We can only provide you the information in aggregate. Similarly, with respect to sales tax, we can't tell you what the sales tax of any individual business presents to the city. I can only generalize and tell you, is it in the first 25, is it the next 25? I can only generalize, and only the city finance director and the city manager are authorized to look at those numbers. So there will be certain limitations to certain information, but we can share with you some reasonable ballpark estimates on hotels.
I think what we're interested in is what the revenue potential going forward, because if you look at your long-range plan, TOT is very flat, and I don't know what, if any, increase you've built in for bringing on additional facilities. Looks like it's more of a 3% kind of inflation kind of a number versus a bringing new facilities on.
Right. There's only one that's been approved that hasn't been built, and there is one under review today. It's about to approach environmental, and that's it in terms of hotels. There are a lot of ideas, but those are the only two that we have currently.
Mary, did you have
Maybe you could be more specific.
Okay, so we have the Vineland Vista.
Rodney Friedrich.
Rodney Friedrich off of Vidovich. This is behind. This
Vineland
is
Station.
Vineland Station, I'm sorry. And that is at Vidovich, where the Nimbus Arts facility is. So that's an approved hotel project. They can come into the city hall tomorrow and seek a building permit, and they can build. The second project is Ted Hall's Farmstead Hotel project, and that was submitted about 2 years ago. It's been through a lot of review. We are close to getting to an environmental review portion of that project, and then that would materialize and move to the Planning Commission. Those are the only 2 hotel projects that we are currently processing or have processed.
Mr. David, did you have a?
Yes. I assume you have a lot of backup on the Nolan Tam work.
Yes.
And obviously all I've seen is what's been in the newspaper, essentially. I think if we're going to dig into this, we really need to understand the work that has already occurred. We need to see the backup. We need to see far more in-depth numbers, if they're available.
They're available.
Because I think that, that's our point of beginning, in a sense. So it would be critical that we have that information soon.
So we'll have you set, when you get to that first meeting, you'll be able to access information that you've been looking for.
I think we're willing to read a lot of it in advance, given that we've only.
Well, that's what we're setting up here.
And just a reminder, we need you to push the button and or be close to the microphones when we speak. Otherwise, the audio doesn't capture the comments very well.
Mr. Dorian, did you have a?
Just want to clarify the protocol for accessing information, particularly from our consultants who the city pays. I'm a little concerned that that we don't have a protocol for that. So I don't know if everyone is just free to contact our consultants individually. I would hesitate to have that as a protocol because it would be unfair to our consultants, frankly, and it would be unfair to the taxpayers. We have to have a system where those requests for information are honored, but in a way that you don't get 10 different requests from an individual who happens to be working from the city. What is the protocol going to be?
That's a really helpful question because we have all of those requests. Any requests for information should run through PRIA. Requests for additional analysis may not be possible because we may not have resources available under a contract. The contract may have been spent, the work may have been done, and no additional money is available, and the council who makes the decisions on these contracts hasn't green-lighted additional work. And so sometimes we'll be working with limited, the information that's available, we won't be able to invest in an additional analysis, a deeper dive. And in most cases, we don't have a lot of resources left in any of the contracts that we've worked on related to these assets. The only one that's still more in motion than the others happens to be the utility undergrounding master plan. But that work is already has a scope of work, and the contractor is working on that scope of work.
Just to follow up on my first question, so how would that work? Would a request for information from PRIA come through a subcommittee or the entire task force, or would an individual be allowed to say, look, I need something from Mark Walsh, I need this huge report or something? I still want to hone that in. How do those questions get filtered from the task force to PRIA to whoever is going to provide that information in a reasonable, cost-effective way?
My recommendation is you work through the chair of the committee. There may be, and when requests roll through PRIA, my expectation is PRIA is going to be in direct communication with me on a regular basis, and we're going to be analyzing what information we already have, and sometimes we're going to have to say, no, that information is not available. Sometimes if it's a quick question, a consultant can answer that question, we can get that information. But there will be probably situations where we just won't have the information. We'll have to make an educated guess with a footnote related to our assumptions. But I have found it helpful working with bodies like this to work through the chair for the requests so that we limit the number of contacts and keep everyone focused on the questions. It helps us organize the work of the task force rather than having 7 different emails coming at us at different directions. So if we can work through the chair, that would really be helpful. And I know Priya and I are going to be working very closely with you over the next several months, providing you data and information.
And I'm glad that you clarified that, because I can see a level of frustration that would build up these ladies and gentlemen are experts in their fields and they like information, and sometimes the information may not be readily available or may not be available from a cost perspective. And so I would hate to have people walk away going, I didn't get the information I needed. So there's got to be some kind of filter through the chair, which I agree with. Thank you.
So I'm going to take I'll take a few more questions, but I believe we need to open it to public comment. So I'll take two more questions and then we'll...
I just wanted to make one comment, which is to remember you have 3 subject matter experts at your disposal as well. Tom Mallon, long-range financial forecasting seems to be in his wheelhouse. Glenn Geltz, who is here, CFO experience and financial experience, and Dale Grossman, a lot of experience in long-term debt. So those people are free of charge, and I think it's up to the chairman and the committee to figure out how to work with them, either individually or with subcommittees.
Just quick question. It's my understanding the Nolan Tam report is online. There's a link to it? Can you guys confirm? I believe it's in the minutes from that meeting when it was presented, which is the same information that was presented to you all. So it's kind of what the official working kind of document.
Yeah,
so, I think
Priya can probably put a link to that
I
because
think
it
there's
was
probably
presented.
a handful of links that would answer a lot of these questions. If we could get that out before the thing, I think that would be useful.
Okay, I'm going to open it to public comment at this point. Seeing none, I will close the public comment. I'll bring it back to the council. Mr. Wallach, did you have one last?
No, the last thing about going through the chair answered my question.
Okay. Are there any other thoughts from the task force or the council? All right. Oh, Mr. Presswich?
So with respect to the draft agenda, I think I'm going to work with our finance director. I'll work with Mark Walsh. We may need to modify a little bit of this so we don't overwhelm you and have this turn into a 4-hour meeting. But is there anything else on the agenda here that we're missing that you would like to include on your second agenda, or is this too ambitious already?
Feels okay.
Okay.
Okay, that's very helpful.
Thank you. Okay, and with that, I appreciate everybody focus and attention and being here, and I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you. Just